What's going on YouTube? Today we're going to talk about sandbox evasion techniques. And before we talk about sandbox evasion techniques, guys, let's first define what is a sandbox. So basically here, the term sandbox refers to any operating system, or let me say virtualized environment or containerized environment. In this environment, we can customize the type of the operating system and the type of software that's installed on the environment. So basically you can just create a virtual machine and you can call it sandbox. Okay, so it can be Windows, the OS, or it can be Linux, it can even be Mac, right? Mac OS. So basically that's the definition of sandbox, a containerized environment or virtualized environment where you are able to customize the operating system and the software running. Now, what's the purpose of sandbox? Why do we use sandboxes? So basically sandboxes give you a way to analyze suspicious looking files, okay, without harming the production system. So sandboxes is type, or using sandboxes is sort of dynamic analysis in the context of malware analysis, of course. So what we can do here, we can drop all the suspicious files, so malware, we can move the malware into inside the sandbox, and we can have the entire freedom in analyzing the malware. You can run the malware, observe its behavior, and come with the conclusion about whether it is malicious. So basically that's the sandbox and the definition of sandboxes. Now when we talk about sandbox evasion techniques, we mean that we want, when we develop our malware, okay, we want the malware to be able to evade sandbox analysis. Okay, the objective is to confuse the sandbox and make it unable to analyze the file or confuse it in the analysis process. For example, say I have developed a malware, okay, and I have implemented all the sandbox evasion techniques that we were going to talk about today. When the malware is moved into the sandbox here, okay, it's going to confuse the sandbox analysis. Okay, and what's going to happen, the sandbox will tell you that the malware or the file in question is not a malware. Okay, so that's what we mean by saying sandbox evasion techniques. Now that you know what's a sandbox and what's the purpose of sandbox evasion techniques, let's talk about sandbox evasion techniques. So the first one is implementing sleeping functions. So as you know, guys, malware sandboxes are often limited to a time constraint to prevent the overallocation of resources. So basically any sandbox here, normally sandboxes are configured with limited resources, okay, because at the end it's a sandbox, right? It's not a production system. So normally in sandboxes we give, like most of the time, 1 core CPU and mostly 2 GB of RAM. These are limited resources and cannot be used in production systems, right? Sometimes sandboxes are given more than 1 core of CPU and up to 4 GB of RAM, especially if it's used extensively for malware analysis or analyzing files. So when we implement sleep functions, what we're going to do, we're going to put a sleep timer. So we're going to implement sleep timer and configure it to sleep for, like, for example, 120 seconds, which corresponds to 2 minutes. So what's going to happen here, guys, the malware in question here, our malware in here, before it runs on the sandbox, it's going to stay idle for 2 minutes. It's not going to do anything. The purpose of that is to bypass the sandbox time constraint. Normally sandboxes are configured to run like for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 6 minutes, depending on the environment. So we implement sleep functions, okay, to evade or to confuse the sandbox. So basically the idea is we implement, guys, a sleep timer that sleeps for a certain period of time before the shell code or the malware is executed. This could be done a number of ways, by the way. One common way is to query the current system time, and in parallel thread we check and see how much time has elapsed. So basically here we query the system time in the OS and see how much time has elapsed for the sandbox, and then based on that we configure the sleeping functions. Now it's always recommended, if you cannot query this information, to make your malware sleep for like 5 or 6 minutes. The recommended period is 5 minutes at least. So make your malware sleep for 5 minutes before it is executed. Okay, now the other method is, or the next method is checking system information. Why do we do that? Because we know that, guys, that most sandboxes typically have reduced resources. As you can see, 1 core CPU, 2 GB. And one example of a sandbox is, let's change the color here. Okay, Anyrun. I think if you analyze files online, you must have known Anyrun, or must have heard of Anyrun. It's an online sandbox service. Now in Anyrun, the sandbox is configured with 1 core CPU, okay, and 4 GB of RAM. So what we're going to do here in this checking system info, we check the system information of the operating system which we target. Okay, if it happens to be 1 core CPU on 4 GB of RAM, we know it is a sandbox. Most workstations in the organizations, most of them are configured with at least 8 GB into up to 32 GB, right? And the hard disk could be between 256 up to 2 TB, and the CPU cores can be between 2 and 8 CPU cores. That's the range you can find in most workstations or endpoints that are used for production, while in sandboxes less resources are given. So when we check system information, we want to know if we were dealing with the sandbox by checking the system information. Based on that, we can tailor the malware here in question. We can tailor the code to query for basic system information. Okay, so that's another way to know we are dealing with the sandbox. The third method is kind of complex, which is checking system information. So the aim here, guys, is to understand whether the target system, in this case it's a sandbox, is part of a domain or not. So again, most workstations here, guys, most workstations are part of a domain, or they are joined into a domain which is part of Active Directory. Okay, most workstations are like that. Okay, and if the machine is not part of an Active Directory, then it is not a target for us, because when we do penetration testing, or we want to sneak into systems, we want a machine that's part of an Active Directory, because the final objective is to take control of the entire domain structure, including the admin. So if the machine is not part of the Active Directory, it means it's either sandbox or something else that we are not interested in. Okay, now the last method is geolocating the target. Okay, so geolocating the target is an effective method. Why? Because most sandboxes are often located off premises and are hosted by antivirus vendors or providers. So off premises, it means that the sandbox is not implemented in the headquarters or the physical location of the organization. Normally it is kind of online service hosted by antivirus providers such as Anyrun. Anyrun is an online service, right? And if your organization or physical location of the servers is, say, in Netherlands, and you are using Anyrun as a sandbox service, so basically when we query your system information, or when we query your network, we will find out that the sandbox location is different than your on-premises location, which happens to be in Netherlands, for example. So if you know you're attacking, for example, a company located in Europe, okay, and the binary or the malware that you have sent, say, to an employee or as an email to someone in the company, and the email or the sandbox has been opened, sorry, the malware has been opened in different location, such as in California, it means that the malware has been opened in a location that most probably a location belongs to a sandbox, okay, or where a sandbox is implemented. That's why we geolocate the target, or we query the geolocation information about the targets. If we know that the organization is located in EU and our malware has been executed in a location that's different than EU, it means it has been executed in a sandbox environment. Okay, now we're going to talk about, we're going to take a challenge here. It's part of TryHackMe. Let me show you the challenge. So, the challenge name is the Great Escape, and we have to build, we are given a code, okay? The code is, it's merely a dropper, malware dropper. We need to implement sandbox evasion techniques, such as check and see if the device is joined to an Active Directory domain, the target device. We also want to run the code to check if the system memory is greater than 1 GB, implement an outbound request to this IP address, and implement sleep function that lasts for 60 seconds. And then in order to get the flag, we have to run the sandbox checker on the sandbox evasion code we have created. If all is good, all the checks are good, we're going to get the flag. Alright, let's do that. So what we're going to do now, guys, we're going to create a shellcode and host it on a web server. This shellcode will be retrieved by the dropper that we will work on after this. So let's first start with MS Venom -p Windows x64 getter reverse TCP, and then lhost will be the attacker IP address. Port equal from 545 -frow -o index.row. The shellcode will be in raw format. Okay. So this shellcode will be retrieved or will be hosted on a web server. Okay. Technically, the web server will be hosted by the attacker machine, and this is the shellcode that will be retrieved by the dropper that we will be working on afterwards. So now we are waiting for the shellcode to be created. Okay, and then we're going to use Python -m http.server, and now we are ready to serve the payload. Okay, as you can see, we have information about the payload such as the size and the name. Okay, now let's switch to the other machine. So if you go to materials, okay, so here what do we have, guys? We have a couple of files. We have first the dropper, okay, and the dropper is the C code of the malware, which we need to work on. So basically this is the malware where we need to implement the sandbox evasion techniques, okay, and this is the malware or the dropper that will download the shellcode we created with MS Venom. Okay, let's now open this malware, but let's first open Microsoft Visual Studio. Alright, so there are a couple of things that we need to change in this code. So let's take a look first at the comments that are created by the developer. Update the DW size variable with your shellcode size. This should be approximately 510 bytes. So since the code here, guys, will be the objective of this code here is to download your shellcode, right? That's why it's named dropper. So you have to put the shellcode information. So here we put the size. The size is 510. Here we have update the open process Windows API with your Explorer process ID. This can be found in Task Manager. So open Task Manager in here, and we find the process ID of Explorer. Go to details, and here it's 3860. Okay. Update the C2 URL with your IP address and the specific URL where your raw shellcode is stored. This corresponds, guys, to the IP address of the attacker machine where we hosted the web server. So if you go here, as you can see, this is the IP address of the attacker machine. And don't forget to put the port if your web server is working or is listening on a specific port. So here we change this with my IP address, or the IP address of the attacker machine. Okay, it seems like I'm going to need to type this manually. 10 89 206 98 206, and then we have 8000, the port, and this is it. Update the buff variable to include your shellcode size. So we will put the shellcode size, which happens to be 510. Update the read file descriptor to include your shellcode size. Again, here we put 510. Okay, so this is it. Okay, yeah. So these are the modifications that we need to create, or we needed to change or to do on the code as far as the shellcode is concerned. Now we're going to apply the sandbox evasion techniques. Let's first save the file. Okay, fine. Now the first thing that we need to do, guys, is to check and see if the device is joined to an Active Directory domain. The first requirement we need to apply here, guys, is to make the code or the dropper malware check if the device, the target device, okay, on which the malware will run, okay, whether it is part of an Active Directory domain. Okay, so how to do that? We can take assistance from the C files created here for us. So edit check is a C code. Okay, we can take a look at, okay, this is the C code, and here we can take a look at the function that checks if the domain or the device is part of Active Directory domain. As you can see, in the main function here we have a call to a function. The function name is domain controller. Okay, and if it is domain controller, we download and execute. Let's take a look at this function here, and this is the function that checks, guys, if the device is part of an Active Directory or not. So let's take it, let's copy that function and implement it in our code. So we have this function, download and execute. Okay, after that function, we put the function that checks if the device is part of a domain controller or not. Right. Another thing is this. First thing, we have to implement the if statement, or the if state. So we take this, okay, and we go here. So the first check we make is if the device is part of a domain controller. So when the malware is executed, guys, the first thing that will get executed is this if statement. It's going to call the function is domain controller, which will check if the device or the target or the victim is part of Active Directory or not. If it is, it's going to execute the malware or to retrieve the shellcode. So that's the first condition we want. So now we have implemented the Active Directory check. The next thing we need to do, guys, is to check if the system memory of the victim is greater than 1 GB of RAM. And we have this here. Let's open the C code here and check the memory. By the way, you have to get back to edit check and see the headers here, if we need to include any. So CS Studio. So let's copy these and add them here. Exactly. Okay, back to memory check. Let's take a look at the code. So the main function, we have an if statement that checks or calls for the memory check function. Let's take a look at the memory check function. This is it. As you can see, it's checking the memory of the target device, whether it is actually equal or more than 5 gigabytes. Okay, in our case, we have to change this to 1. So let's copy the code, or copy the function to the dropper code here. Okay, and here we change 5 to 1. In this case, we check the target device if the memory is greater than 1 gigabyte or not. And we need to include a call to the memory check as well. So basically, as you can see, we have the if statement here. So we take this and we put it here. So here the first check will be on the domain controller. The next check will be on the memory. So let's put this here. Yeah. Okay, so far we have implemented checks on the domain controller and on the memory. Next, we need to implement an outbound request to an IP address 10.10.10.10. So let's first close the memory check. Oh, I think we need something from here, the headers. Let's see here. We need to copy this one. Other than that, we have all of the headers. Okay. Right, so let's now take a look at the geofiltering. Scrolling down, taking a look at the main function. As you can see, we have a call to check IP function. Let's take a look at the function itself. So this is the function. Let's copy that function to our dropper. And here we have to change one thing, which is the IP here. The call will be made to an IP address that is 10.10.10.10. And at the very end, we have to copy the if statement. So, so far we have check on the domain controller. If the target victim is part of the domain controller, then we check on the memory. If the memory is more than 1 gigabyte, then we check on the IP, or we make a call to the IP address specified in the task. And if all is true, we're going to download and execute. Okay. Now the last thing we need to do, guys, is to implement a sleep check or sleep function. So basically, the sleep function will make the code sleep for 60 seconds before execution. Let's take a look here at the sleep function. And before that, let's take a look at the headers here. So all the headers are here. Okay, close this one, and we go to sleep check. Taking a look at the main. So we have, as you can see in the main function, sleep function that sleeps for 60 seconds, meaning 1 minute, and then executes the code. So let's take this and to the dropper, we sleep for 60 seconds, okay, and then we download and execute. So far we have check on the domain controller. If the device is part of the domain controller, we're going to check on the memory. If the memory is 1 gigabyte or more, we're going to make a call to the IP address, and if all is good, we're going to sleep for 60 seconds, okay, And after that, we're going to download and execute the malware. So now after we have made the changes, let's now create a new project in Visual Studio to be able to build the code. So name it THM3, for example, and create. Okay. So now going back to Dropper, right click, edit with Notepad, and we're going to copy the code and replace or paste it here. So then we're going to build, okay, build all. Okay, so here, sleep identifier isn't found. Let's see. So yeah, so it's the S. It has to be uppercase. Let's try now. And the executable has been created. Let's take a look. Okay, so this is the executable. Now what we're going to do, guys, we have a copy of this over to materials and paste it here. Okay, so now we're going to run sandbox checker on our executable and see if all the checks are implemented correctly. Okay, run as administrator, and from here we're going to desktop and cd materials. Okay, and then running sandbox checker on what? On THM. So remember to check found, network found, geofilter found. It's going to check for the sleep function now, and it may take like 1 minute or 2 minutes depending on the duration by which the sleep function has been configured. Sleep check is not found. Debug error. The variable sleep check is being used without being initialized. Retry. So we have sleep check not found on the code. Let's get back. So let's see here. Let's move this way, this side. $60,000 seconds. Okay, so I think we have to move this. We have to first implement the sleep function, okay, before the other checks. So first, when the code is executed or when the malware runs, it's going to sleep for 60 seconds, okay, and then it's going to check on the other criteria. Alright, so save, build. Alright, so we're going to remove this one and then going back to repos, I'm going to copy the new version over to materials and run the command again. And sleep check is found, as you can see, and this is your flag. So guys, that was the room, and I hope you guys found the room useful and the information helpful. So basically that was the great escape, and this is the flag. Thank you for watching.